Hey, y'all, and welcome to the Mr. Maple Show. I'm Tim.
And I'm Sean.
And today we're going to talk to you about foundational plantings. We're going to go through there and talk about what is a foundational planting, why Japanese maples are great to plant near the foundation of your home, considerations you should take when figuring out which Japanese maple I should use, some good recommendations that we have for great Japanese maples that make great foundational plantings, and companion plants when you're doing this. So, everybody, we appreciate all y'all. If y'all don't know anything about us, we're MrMaple.com. We're a family mail order business. We ship directly to your door. We do over 1,000 varieties of Japanese maples. And if you like this type of content, make sure you're liked, subscribed, and share this video with your gardening friends.
So what is a foundational planting? Corbin and I were talking about this a little earlier, and he's like, well, you know, that term foundational can mean a lot of different things. But traditionally with landscaping, foundational planting is what you plant around your foundation, around your house. And typically, back in the day, older structures, older houses were usually built on a foundation. You might live in a house that has a crawl space, but you'll see that space between your house and that ground. And foundational planting was a way to kind of camouflage that, to cover that up.
Yeah, and it's been a place where people traditionally garden right beside of their home with typically smaller plants to be able to enjoy just the beauty of gardening right up next to their house. Sometimes that's, separates their yard. Sometimes it's in between of a walkway. There's a lot of different things with foundational plantings. But the key thing is all these plants that you're choosing for this are going up right beside of your home. And so you got to take a lot of different things into consideration. Sean, why do you think Japanese maples make good foundational plantings?
Well, traditionally, you see a lot of places, because not only with that up next to your house or your walkways and stuff like that, but you want it to also use that with landscaping to lead you somewhere, almost kind of take your eye and move you, whether it's moving down the path to the front door of the house. So why Japanese maples? Because I think we've gotten boring plants, or things have nothing against boxwoods or anything, or those or you boxwood lovers, but I think they've gotten overused. And yeah, they can be used for neat things, for contrast of shapes and stuff like that. But I believe Japanese maples offer so much more in terms of seasonal colors. You get more out of a Japanese maple. And then also why Japanese maples? They have non-invasive root systems. You don't have to worry about those plants or these trees affecting your foundation.
Yeah, I mean, you can't say that about regular maples. I'm a former president of the Maple Society here in North America. And when it comes to Japanese maples, they're special because they have those non-invasive roots. They're easy to grow, they're low maintenance, and there's such a diversity in size, shape, color, and habit that you can choose almost any different Japanese maple for your spot and find a Japanese maple that fits your spot perfectly. It's crazy. I mean, we've got one of the largest selections of Japanese maples in the United States here at Mr. Maple. We do over 1,500 different varieties. And when it comes to finding something that has a unique characteristic or something that's small to fit in those small spaces, I mean, Japanese maples just fit so well. And that's one of the things you want to start considering when you're trying to figure out which trees or shrubs to put up next to your home. Size, I would say, is critical. I mean,
oh, absolutely.
You don't want to put a 40-foot tree right there beside your home. I mean, a Dawn redwood right beside your home with a giant redwood, probably not a good idea. They've got an invasive root system. I mean, that's something you need to consider. Are these plants you're putting up next to your home, do they have invasive root systems? Japanese maples do not. But even within Japanese maples, there are ones that have different sizes. And so you can go with one based on the size area that you have. And do keep in mind, we talk about Japanese maples in 10-year sizes here at Mr. Maple. And that's because mature sizes are kind of made up. If a plant isn't growing, a tree or shrub isn't growing every year, it's probably dead. And every time it puts out leaf or growth, I mean, it does it every single year, sometimes twice in the season. So, keep in mind your 10-year size consideration and how you want it to fill out and look in your foundational planting in your home and garden.
And then something else to consider is the color. If you have a red brick house, you don't want to go with something that's red. Japanese maples offer so many different colors. You've got yellows, you've got greens. So if you have that red brick, you can put something green up against it and have it contrast and it shows and pops.
And I think that's something that is a common mistake many people make. I mean, you've got your traditional red weeping lace leaf that people often use as a foundational planting right as they come off their porch to the left or to the right. There's typically a weeping red lace leaf, and they have sometimes a brick background, and the tree gets lost. I mean, a red weeping lace leaf is beautiful. Don't get me wrong. And with the right background, if it was a white background or the brick was painted white, it would show up very well. But a green Japanese maple in that same spot would contrast against that red brick, give you the same overall weeping habit, the same shape, and give you a more lively, summery feel. So you want to keep in mind what type of mood that you want for that space as well. But by opening it up and using something that color contrasts with the green, like you're mentioning, that is critical in trying to figure out, hey, what do I want to put here beside my home?
And then another consideration is shape. So you have this window that you look out of from your living room. Well, you don't want something growing up and blocking that view. So you want to consider that shape. You want to consider something that's not going to get too tall. And that's what's great about Japanese maples is that there are varieties out there that you know are going to fill in but not block that window view.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that's really important when it comes to figuring out what your space is. I mean, obviously, you've got your foundation over your home, but sometimes you visit and see the rest of your garden through your windows while you're in your home. And if you've got a tree blocking it, I mean, what's the point of having a window? So really important to figure out which shape works best in different circumstances. You know, you may use a tall, skinny plant on a corner of a home. You may use it beside or between windows, but you're not going to put that in front of your window. Just something to always keep in consideration. What shapes do you want, and what type of presence do you want desired out there in the garden?
And then something else to consider, and it's very important. It's not just something else, but it's something you need to consider is your sun exposure. Which way is this garden facing the sun when the sun comes up and goes down? What kind of exposure you're going to get from the sun?
And that's really important, especially where you're at with these sun exposures. If you've got something that's southwest exposure, I mean, you're going to have to go with a more heat tolerant variety that can handle, if you're going for the Japanese maple, that can handle that southwest exposure, especially if your house is made of something like brick. I mean, it's going to be radiating heat. If you've got something like wood, not as big of a problem, but you got to think about stone, brick. Those things radiate a lot of heat. And if you've got something on the southwest side, you better go with a heat tolerant variety that's going to be able to handle those high heat settings.
And I also try to remind people that when we talk about sun exposure, and you talked about that heat radiating, but there is a difference between heat tolerant and sun tolerant. You might have a tree that can handle high temperatures, but may not be able to handle sun exposure all day long.
Yeah, I mean, and that's something that's really important to consider. Here in Western North Carolina, we're kind of lucky. I mean, most of the varieties can handle full sun, all the way around the house, even near a brick home, which is really impressive. There are certain varieties we may avoid, but here in a little bit later, we'll actually give you some good recommendations of trees that are easy and hardy for you for these foundational plantings. Now, one thing to also consider is your drainage in the area. I think drainage is key with any Japanese maple. You want to make sure that it has not wet feet. If it gets wet, you want to let it dry out again before it, gets wet again. You don't want Japanese maples to always have their roots wet. If around the foundation of your home, it's always wet, one, you're probably going to have issues with the foundation of your home. You need to get some drainage figured out around your house. But you'll kill your Japanese maples while you're trying to figure that out. So get your drainage figured out before you put your Japanese maples in.
Yeah, I would, when I was doing landscape design and install, before I would go and recommend certain plants, I would go out there to the property and I would dig a hole, not too deep, maybe about a foot deep, foot wide, and I'd fill it with water. And some of these homeowners would come out and look at me and be like, what are you doing? And I'm testing to see what the drainage is. And that's all you got to do is dig a hole about a foot deep, foot wide, and fill it with water and see how quickly that drains. If you fill that with water and you come out the next day and it's still holding water, you need to do something with that soil.
Yeah, and most of the time, if you have that red clay like we have here in Western North Carolina, it doesn't drain as well. And that's basically one of the only times you really need to amend the soil or create conditions that the water flows away from the plant once it gets established out there, because you don't want the Japanese maple to be sitting in that wet feet.
So, and that kind of goes in back to that another consideration is the soil condition, and that drainage kind of helps with it. But like you say, with that clay, or you have to consider, do I need to do any soil amending to have a quality spot for my tree?
Yeah, and that's something to always consider whenever you're planting a Japanese maple, is seeing, do we have good drainage? Do we have a decent amount of airflow to the roots so this tree can get established and do well here in the garden very quickly? When you have a foundational planting, you're gardening right there beside your home. And so it's always important to try to think about how that flows away from your house, and how these situations are something that a Japanese maple can thrive in as well. You've got to think about the overhangs on your homes. Often those overhangs will go 2 to 3 feet. Is this an area that gets natural water when it rains? Is it somewhere that I will have to set up a watering system to have plants thrive and do well right there next to my home? And then if you're setting up a watering system, where's that excess water go after I water my plants? Just always things to consider when you're working right there beside your home.
And you talk about that overhang from a roof. You know, some older houses don't have gutters and stuff like that. So something else to be conscious of is that water runoff from the roof. If you don't have a way to collect it and divert it in another direction, when you get a heavy rain, is your garden spot going to fill up with more water than the plants can handle?
Yeah. I mean, it's totally something to consider. Now, next, we're going to go into some recommendations. And these are classic recommendations that you can find. We offer them often on MrMaple.com. These are ones we try to keep in stock as much as possible. I'm going to start off with a classic here with waterfall. You mentioned a green lace leaf earlier. This is a weeping green lace leaf, also known as Verdus out there. It has a nice cascading habit, typically reaching 4 feet in height by 6 foot in width in 10 years. One thing is it slowly gets some height with it, but it definitely gets width quicker. If you've got an area where you've got that kind of room, I mean, that is an excellent lace leaf. You've got the width. The lace leaves have that weeping habit. It's an excellent foundational planting.
Absolutely, especially like we mentioned before, but a lot of houses are darker, and that green, putting that green up there just helps that pop, helps it show more, and it gives you a contrast between the house. Because typically when I try to design a land, choose plants and stuff like that, one, it's important to look out from, like we talked about that window, look out at the garden, but also to stand back and look at the garden against the house, because your house, your foundation is the backdrop.
Next, y'all, we're going to talk about red dragon. Now, this is a classic red weeping Japanese maple, but it's one of the slower growers, typically reaching 4 to 5 feet in height by 4 to 5 foot in width in 10 years. Now, it is a dark maroon, but when the sunlight hits it and the wind blows, it actually looks a little brighter red because the backside of the leaf gets a little bit of an orange-red kind of color. And it is a slow-growing Japanese maple for the garden.
It is, and just the shape of it, it's unique, it's different, and the way that it weeps, but also kind of spreads out as well, it's one that you're not going to have to worry about, hey, it's blocking my window or it's blocking a view.
And it does have that deep maroon to brighter red kind of foliage. And so if you've got a lighter backdrop to your home, this would make an excellent choice for a lighter colored home. If you're going for that dark colored home, that waterfall, excellent choice. And those are the classic, typical recommendations when people look at the foundation of their home, foundational plantings. Their often first choice that they know about is that weeping Japanese maple. And that's what people think about when they're thinking about Japanese maples. We're going to get into a few other ones that are kind of unique and different. The first one that I'm going to talk about is Makawa Yatsubusa. This was the 2014 Maple of the Year. It looks like a little bonsai out there. It has a tightly layering shingling habit. It's easy to grow, low maintenance, as all these are on this list. And it can handle a bit of heat, but it's just uniquely special because it has this lively feel, like a little character or creature out there in the garden. And so if you're looking for something a little more interesting with a chartreuse green leaf, Makawa Yatsubusa makes an excellent foundational planting.
And what I like about Makawa with talking about foundational planting is it is one of those that, if I have a spot coming up on a corner of a house or coming around, and I've got a limited space, Makawa Yatsubusa is going to fit that space. It's not going to take over, and it's just going to fill and brighten up that spot as you take turns around corners of houses and foundations.
Now, another one that I'm going to recommend is Kiyohime. Now, this is an excellent selection of a Japanese maple to go underneath a window because it doesn't get a lot of height, but it does get the width to it. Now, there are some other varieties like Murasaki Kiyohime that do get a little more height. Kiyohime has a lot more lateral growth, and it has in the early spring a bright purple-red border. It fits in a lot of people's landscape, creating a small circular pattern. If you plant this up closer to the home, sometimes you can only get a half circle, just depending on how close you place it to the home.
With this, I always think of that with Kiyohime, this is, to me, the perfect tree as that boxwood replacement along the house. You see that at traditional, that you see a lot of people just like to run the foundation with one plant. And this is one, if you want to keep that, if you don't want to change up different Japanese maples, stuff like that, this one you can mass plant in that line and you'll get that shrub-like aesthetic against the house, but at the same time, you get spring interest, and then you get the summer interest, and you get fall interest, where with a boxwood, you don't get anything like that.
And then lastly, I'm going to talk about is Twombly's Red Sentinel. Now, this is one that stays fairly narrow as it ages. It gets some height about 6 to 8 foot in 10 years, sometimes 8 to 10 foot. But so it doesn't get very tall in 10 years, but it also doesn't get very wide. And it's a flagpole of color, typically reaching about 3 feet in width in 10 years. And so it stays fairly narrow for those narrow spots at your foundational planting. This works really well, especially if you have a walkway coming through, but you want to add a Japanese maple upright with some good red color. You just still don't want to put it in front of your window. But if you've got, 5 foot of space between your windows, you could get a vertical interest in there with the Twombly's Red Sentinel.
And I'm glad you said that vertical interest, because that is so important. I think that is many times overlooked when planting is that vertical interest. Twombly's Red Sentinel is the perfect tree to add that vertical interest.
Now, guys, I like gardening, especially low maintenance gardening. I think that is critical. Japanese maples, they're excellent for low maintenance gardening. And when making these gardens, we're going to use some other plants besides Japanese maples. So we're going to talk to you about other low maintenance companion plants you can put with your Japanese maples.
So we're going to start with ground cover. And ground cover, we kind of talked about this before we went on camera, but we said, well, do we recommend this as in the maple recommendations, or is this just a companion plant? So it is a maple, but using something like Ryusin, one of those weepers that sits low and flat as a ground cover, to me, you're adding those spring, summer, and fall interest as a ground cover.
Yeah, I mean, something like Ryusin or even Golden Falls that has the yellow color would work really well as a ground cover if you started with a low graft that really hadn't been staked up of either of those. That it can just sort of crawl across the ground and give you some nice color, but can also make a ground cover appearance in your garden. Now, some other low-growing ground covers are sedums. Things like Angelina. There's some amazing yellow sedums out there like Creeping Jenny that would work fantastic. If you look at some of our photos of Anabashidari, so we've actually planted Creeping Jenny underneath the trees at my parents' home, and it gives good color contrast, especially with some of the red Japanese maples. I love color contrast because it's really how you make things pop, give some lively feel out there in the garden. And if you put a yellow next to a red, it really stands out. That's one of the reasons why I like using these sedums, because if you can cover the ground, I mean, you could put mulch out there, but then that mulch is still always going to grow weeds. But if you can cover the ground with a ground cover of some sort, it becomes less maintenance because there's less sunlight hitting the ground for seeds to pop up in weeds.
Exactly, weed. And then it also helps with moisture control with that. We talked earlier about having good soil and soil that drains. Ground cover is a way to help with that, to control the moisture and the water in the soil.
Now, another thing that makes a great foundational planting that pairs well with your Japanese maples are some of the dwarf conifers. People often don't realize that we have such a large conifer selection at MrMaple.com. We're known for our Japanese maples, but if you go click on the conifer section, there's typically 1, 2, sometimes 3 pages of conifers. And many of those are dwarf conifers that would do well for foundational plantings. Some of the dwarf pines, be it the white pines, the Japanese white pines, or the Pinus mugos, the mountain pines, those stay shorter and denser and make a nice evergreen presence out there, make an excellent foundational planting. And when you have an evergreen presence paired with your deciduous, when the Japanese maple leaves out, when it goes through the summer, when it goes to the fall color, it becomes more dynamic out there in those seasons.
And it gives that contrast to those Japanese maples. You got that color. And with that, so you can take some of those, like we talked about waterfall, or even say red dragon with that red, and you pair it up against some of these dwarf conifers, you get that contrast in texture and color as well.
Now, another great companion plant in this foundational setting are some of the Satsuki azaleas. Now, I love the Satsuki azaleas because they stay dense and compact. They're a selection of Satsuki azalea that they bloom during the late spring to early summer months. And so when your Japanese maple may be at its weakest point, you've got something out there blooming, giving you an additional interest during those types of the season.
And I like to think of a garden as a symphony. When you go listen to music, a symphony, not everyone's always playing at the same time. They have their moments, they have their time, but it all comes together and makes one thing. And with this, what you talked about, you've got those blooming, you've got something going on all the time.
Now, another plant that makes a great companion plant, we don't want it near the base of the Japanese maple, but around the foundational planting are those Japanese forest grass. They give a unique interest out there. Selections like Areola or All Gold give you some yellow color out there in the landscape on a forest grass that's going to be low maintenance and easy to grow. They're going to be able to handle those drier conditions just like the Japanese maples. Again, I wouldn't put them next to the base of the Japanese maple, but if you give it some space, it can give you a unique interest out there.
And something just to consider with companion plants when planting around Japanese maples is that watering. You don't want to plant anything around those Japanese maples around your house that require more water than the Japanese maples will need, because you will give those Japanese maples wet feet and they're not going to do well.
And lastly, before we get into summing everything up, one thing to consider too, as a companion out there with your Japanese maple, is hardscaping. A nice rock goes a long way in the landscape, even as a foundational spot up near your home, just to give it something unique to play off of in the landscape.
That's a great rocks and other stuff. Even consider containers. We're talking about Japanese maples, but there's so many Japanese maples that do well in containers. We can move a pot into one of those spots, and just the container in there, a decorative container that drains well, can add so much to the hardscape and also to the foundational planting.
Now, if you're considering growing a container Japanese maple, check out our podcast. We've got a whole podcast on how to grow a Japanese maple in a container. And we also have videos on, can I basically mulch my garden with rocks? Like how do rocks affect Japanese maples? So you can check that out as well. Y'all, this has been our foundational planting podcast, landscaping with Japanese maples for your foundational planting. We've covered why Japanese maples make great foundational plants, considerations from size, shape, color, sun exposure, drainage, and soil conditions. You can find the Japanese maple that's going to fit your spot. And I think that's important. It's mostly important is you want to be thoughtful in this process, because Japanese maples have so much variation that you can find a Japanese maple for nearly any spot in the garden. And we've given you some good recommendations, from waterfall and red dragons, your traditional foundational plantings, to some unique ones like Makawi Etsubusa, Kiyohime, and Twombly's Red Sentinel.
And be sure to, in those comment sections, if there's a tree, we talked about just a handful, but if there's a tree that you've used in your foundational planting, let us know in those comments and why you like it.
Y'all, thanks so much for jumping in today. Make sure make sure you subscribe to our YouTube show, the MrMaple Show here, and we do a weekly podcast on your favorite podcast platform. It's called the MrMaple Show. Make sure you share that with your gardening friends as well.
Take care.
God bless.
And have a great day.